evening, everyone.
Hello.
Buenas noches. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bon dia.
Bon dia.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Ni hao.
Ni hao.
Memenjes.
Memenjes.
Dobre utro.
Dobre utro.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Sawadi.
Sawadi.
Shawem.
Shawem.
Mananangumanga.
Mananangumanga.
Como ye?
Como ye?
Sopa wanang song.
Sopa wanang song.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Privet.
Privet.
Guten Tag.
Guten Tag.
Kalamara.
Kalamara.
Konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa.
And as they say in Hebrew, Shalom.
Shalom.
Those are some of the various cultures that live within our community. Those are some of the various cultures that live within southeastern Connecticut. And the reason why I start off with all those various cultures is because climate change affects everyone. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, your socioeconomic status, your background. This topic is true and dear to all of us, and it needs to be. And when I think about this topic, it's very close to my home. This, to me, is one of the most important topics of the 21st century. And we really need to focus on this topic and tackle this topic, because I would love to see some of our wonderful students and kids have a brighter future. So that's why we're going to have experts as well as incredible students on the panel this evening to discuss some of these topics. But first, we're going to start off with Bonnie Johnson. She's going to give us a presentation, and then we're going to lead into one of our expert scientists within our community, Roger, and he's going to show us some of the great work he's doing as well. And then we'll proceed into the panel. So let's have an awesome time, let's get inspired, and let's continue to learn.
To start, I had a quote from David Attenborough, who is my favorite naturalist. He's the voice of planet Earth. So he says, "I'm no longer skeptical. I no longer have any doubt at all. I think climate change is the major challenge facing the world." And I believe that is true, and myself as well. And I put on the slide satellite imagery, which is one of the primary tools we use to track climate change in the world. So we see burn scars from a fire out in California. We see the coral reefs, which are bleaching because of the warming ocean. We see flooding around the Mississippi River. We see sea level rise, where islands in the Pacific are now going underwater. We see calving of our sea ice in Antarctica. And then we have witnessed in the last few years some severe hurricane events, particularly in 2017, where we had some of the largest hurricanes we've experienced in the world. So this is just a little perspective on how scientists track these changes. So what is climate versus weather? I think this is a common misconception we have, that climate and weather are very different things. So to put that into perspective, it's basically a measure of time and scale. So weather is going to be a short-term impact on your local area. So conditions of the atmosphere in a short time period. So is it raining out? Is the sun out? Are we going to expect clouds tomorrow? It's going to be minute to minute, hour to hour, and it's going to be local. So if you have a snowstorm today, that doesn't mean the climate has gotten colder. It's just what's happening in that moment. Whereas climate is how the atmosphere behaves over a long period of time. So that is going to be average temperatures, average conditions. It's going to be what you see in the patterns of weather in a particular location, but over a long period of time. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Because I think sometimes there's a misconception about that. And now I want to talk about some of the history of climate change data and what scientists use to back up their findings about how the climate is changing. This is a little dark, I'm sorry, but you can see here it's a graph of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it goes back, the graph is here, it's extrapolated all the way back to 450,000 years to modern day. And what do you notice here? You see that around 1900s, which coincides very well with the Industrial Revolution, you see a massive increase in the atmospheric CO2. So this data, in the last 120 years, it goes to show that the human influence on atmospheric CO2 has gone up massively. This data was collected from 2 stations. There's one in Hawaii, it's a weather station. It monitors atmospheric CO2 levels, and it's been doing it constantly since 1958. And so this station has been made famous for its climate data. The data before 1950s is from ice coring in Antarctica. So they can actually take ice cores and using the bubbles in the ice, they can find out what the atmospheric CO2 was dating back before 1950s. So that is our continuous data going back 450,000 years. Let's talk about what are the drivers of climate change. There are 2 varieties that I'll discuss. One is natural causes, and one are anthropogenic, and anthropogenic is the way to say human-caused. So natural fluctuations for climate change have been variations in sunlight, so the strength of the sun has changed over time with how close the planet is to the sun, and also the strength of the radiation from the sun. You also have the impact of volcanic eruptions. So back in the 90s, there was Mount Pinatubo erupted, and you can see a decrease in the global temperature that year because of all the gases and particles that went into the atmosphere. So the volcanoes can also have a cooling effect because of all the particles. They reduce the amount of sunlight that actually makes it through the atmosphere. It can also lead to warming because it will increase greenhouse gases. So times of great volcanism in our Earth's history, we had a warming effect because there were a lot more gases being emitted. Then the infamous El Nino events can also cause global climate changes depending on the strength of the event, and that has to do with the Pacific Ocean, the warming patterns. The ocean is very tied to our atmosphere. For anthropogenic events, we think about the greenhouse gases. So I think everyone's probably heard of the greenhouse effect. So we're thinking about emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other gases that are going to have a warming effect on the planet. We have emissions from industry, from vehicles, planes, from agriculture. Other changes we've made to the planet that affect climate change would be land cover, so how we've modified the coverage on the Earth, and deforestation. So as we know, trees absorb CO2, and when we cut them down, we lose that ability. We actually put CO2 into the atmosphere when we cut down a tree, and then you lose that ability to absorb CO2. So that is also going to have a warming effect. I'll go back to the Keeling curve just to make this point in that in 2016, our CO2 in the atmosphere went over 400 parts per million. So this is, again, that Keeling graph. You can see how the rise is dramatic. That green line is 400 parts per million. The last time we had that level of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the Earth was a few degrees warmer, and the sea level was tens of meters higher than it is today. So that, at that time, last time we had 400 parts per million, those were the conditions on the Earth. Warmer, higher sea levels. So this was, the 400 parts per million was a marker for scientists, and when we surpassed it, it was a pretty big deal, I would say. I'm going to go through a little bit just to not overwhelm you with information. As I mentioned before, the IPCC came about in 1988. They have been the international community's way of studying, all scientists coming together from different countries, and to put out information that's transparent and objective to help governments and communities make decisions about how climate change is impacting them and what preparation or changes they might want to make to prepare for it. So for how do we track climate change? What are our indicators? Several things that are most prominent would be the levels of carbon dioxide, global temperature, Arctic ice coverage, ice sheets and sea level. So this is information that I'm going to present is from NASA's climate website. Predominantly, these are the ways that scientists track what the impacts of climate change may be. You measure the amount of greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere. We measure the temperature, extreme weather events, incidents of floods and droughts. The oceans, what is happening with our oceans? The oceans are actually a massive heat sink. They absorb a lot of the heat, more so than the atmosphere. So our warming oceans, how much the sea level is rising, and then ocean acidification, which is what happens when CO2 is absorbed by the ocean. It leads to acidification. We have snow and ice loss. They're tracking the impact of climate change on health in society. So you might have an increase in disease because of warming temperatures and from extreme events. So oftentimes you have outbreaks of cholera following an extreme drought. And then the impact on our ecosystems. So loss of species, loss of forests, loss of habitat that have to do with climate change. So the greenhouse effect, I think because I don't want to take up too much of your time, I might advance a little bit. We have the greenhouse effect is one of the factors we cover. Weather and climate are usually mapped as how over time you can see how the temperature compared to an average, how much warmer it is, an anomaly is. So where it's red, it's that much warmer than it's supposed to be. So maybe 4 degrees warmer than on average. In this case, not only is it the warmest year on record, but the last 10 years have been the warmest on record as well. Our oceans are warming, as I said, and which leads to sea level rise because water expands as the ocean warms. We have our shrinking ice caps and glaciers retreating, and sea ice was at its lowest ever recorded this year. What are the environmental impacts that this will have? So those were our trackers. Going forward, what do we think our impacts might be? Or what are we seeing already, not even forward? So right now we have our warming oceans. We have seen from the warming oceans a rise in sea levels, which is causing changes to our shorelines, to our coastlines, to our habitats there, to people's homes and the economy. We've had disruption of ocean currents and of weather patterns. So when you have the jet stream dipping down like we've seen these extreme cold weather events. That's tied to changes in our wind patterns that are also connected to our ocean currents. So these are impacting our weather locally as well. We've seen extreme weather events. So when you have a warmer ocean, you have more heat to fuel these hurricanes that are collecting more water. They're staying warmer for longer, which makes them more destructive when they hit land. With all of the warming oceans, we're seeing loss in diversity in the oceans as well. Species have evolved over millions of years, and when the ocean temperatures change quickly, a lot of species can't adapt. In particular, coral reefs. Coral is very sensitive to warming temperatures, so you see coral bleaching. There's a possibility at this time that by 2050, coral reefs are no more. The coral has been, at this point, we're seeing 90% bleaching every year, so it's very severe. We're seeing insects extinction. So there's some connections to climate change. There's still a lot of unknowns about animal extinction, but there's a loss of biodiversity happening. Extreme weather events, again, are going to become more common. So I think for interest of time, Mr. Booker, I will just end with one slide here about social political impacts. So going forward, we've seen that impacts of droughts, effects on the economies, agriculture. We've seen the impacts of the devastation of these extreme events. We've seen a lot of climate refugees as well. So these are things that are going to continue as the warming continues. You have to think about what the impacts are going to be on society and on political climate as well. And I had some more slides, but I think I'm going to pass it off, and then so we can have some more voices in the room. All right.
The three biggest challenges each of us have with respect to climate change. Can somebody give me the biggest challenge first? Any idea?
We as individual people, or?
You or people you know, any scale you want. The biggest challenge. Yeah.
Education, people don't
Facts. Education. Because there's a large percentage of the population and a percentage of our elected officials that either will not address climate change, or some say it's not real. Okay. So if your doctor came up to you and said, you know, Sean, if you take these pills, there's a 97% chance you're going to be Iron Man. Would you take them? Yeah. Now, what if a climate scientist came up to you and said, you know, there's 100 people in the room here, and 97% of those scientists out of the 100 say that climate change is real, it's largely human caused, and it's urgent. Would you believe 97 or 3? 97. Yeah. So of those 3, by the way, this is a big misconception in these statistics. It doesn't mean the 3 are saying it doesn't exist. One of the 3 will say, haven't made up my mind yet. Another one will say, yeah, but we don't understand the Earth, it's really complicated. And the third one might say no. Okay? So, when you get into an argument and say you have to have a non-climate person arguing against the 97 scientists that say it's real, this is no longer needed. Okay? So, I just want to say that. So the biggest problem is actually getting all Americans to understand that climate change is real. What's the second biggest thing?
Transportation?
That's down on the list, but keep that in your head. Second thing, think of yourselves now. How hard is it for us to go, all I gotta do is stop eating meat. All I gotta do is drive an electric car.
Change.
What?
Lifestyle change.
Change, exactly. It's our lifestyles, the choices we made. This is actually, we can't do all the other stuff until we face this. This deals with every aspect of climate, social justice, all the different kinds of injustices, economic, environmental, and social. All of these things. So, on that score, how do we vote every day? Purchases. Your strongest vote is with your pocketbook.
Yes.
What the companies put in the store, or if your power company wants to have more solar farms, depends on what you buy. What's the third thing?
You turn off the water faucet.
Now that's an important thing, but it's further down the list. And you're going to be able to do this soon, young man.
Voting.
Vote.
Yes.
Oh, you're getting this. Wow. All right. Voting. The only way we affect change in a democracy is to vote. Is not voting an option? What do you think? No. It's a right and a privilege and a necessity. Democracy is not a spectator sport. If you don't participate, after one of the elections we had a couple times ago, people said, I didn't like anybody, so I didn't vote. And I said, you voted for the winner. No, I didn't. I didn't like that person either. If you didn't vote, you voted for the winner, even if you don't like them. Okay? So, every election, every scale, from, school board, city council, district, state, and federal. Every election you must vote in because every level matters. It is now a life and death decision, by the way, because of climate change. And does climate change impact things like social injustices?
Yeah.
Can you name one way that does that? Yeah, you got it. So what?
I was pointing to my dad.
He's one of the social injustices? He's not letting you watch Star Trek reruns? Well, obviously, one of them that affects us right here, and I loved, Kevin, your hellos in 30 languages, because immigration. How many people do you think left New Orleans after some of the hurricanes down there? Do you realize the large percentage of the workforce in the south side of Chicago is because people fled after hurricanes in the 20s? These are climate refugees. Where did people from Puerto Rico go, by the way? They lost 10% of their population from Hurricane Maria. One hurricane, 10%. Ann and I were just down there. It's seriously real. So, where do they come?
Florida?
Connecticut.
Connecticut. A whole bunch of them are right here. Right. And the son of one wrote a pretty incredible play called Hamilton. So I want to talk about a couple things. I'm going to talk about immediate effects right here. So Bonnie mentioned things about the ocean. The oceans actually absorb 80% of the heat as the atmosphere warms. So the oceans, they're like the slow motion snowball downhill, right? I mean, it takes so long to warm an ocean relative to our reference. Now, I'm an economic geologist, so I'm always late for dinner because I'm waiting for a million years slot in the schedule, right? So, but one of the things we know about oceans, as an economic geologist, I've studied climate change my entire career, and I'm 130 years old. I feel like it some days. But the thing is, everything on Earth is connected. You are part of all of these ecosystems. And when the ocean changes, what's one of the main impacts that's going to impact your survivability?
Water.
Fish. You know, with the death of the reefs, we cannot feed 2.5 billion people. 2.5 billion. 2.5 billion people! I mean, that's a lot of people. That's how much humans are dependent on just the reef ecosystem. Okay? And this has already happened. This has been going on since the 70s was like heart attack city for climate change, because before the 70s, you're kind of creeping up. At the 70s, you get highs and lows, hot winters, cold winters, hot summers, colds. It's like the Earth is in defibrillation, and it's like, I don't know what to do. When you get to like 1982, 83, guess what's happened? The Earth says, okay, if you're going to pump all this extra carbon into the carbon cycle, which, by the way, the Earth was not planning on using because it sequestered it into coal seams, into oil deposits, into natural gas deposits, right? When you take that stuff out of sequestered carbon, the Earth goes, whoa, oh, what are you doing there? I don't like this, because that means I got to change everything. Why? Because it warms up, just as you showed. And the Keeling curve is incredible because it's, since the 50s, it's a consistent actual measurement. And the 450 years of ice cores, 700,000 years of ice cores in Greenland, by the way, we see this stuff and can measure it. It is not a theory. This is really important. When somebody says, oh, climate change, the theory of climate change, it is not a theory. It's a proven function of the Earth, and it's a proven fact that it's happening. This is not a theory, okay? So when the oceans warm, it directly impacts us. Now, how about the coastal environment? Well, I run a small sustainability company, and in the past, some of my clients have lived along the coast, and they say, I don't understand why my basement's always wet. Why do you think their basement's always wet?
Sea level.
Sea levels rising,
Right. And what's causing the sea level to rise?
ice caps melting.
And? Heat?
The water temperature.
Yes.
How does the water temperature?
Okay, go home and take a glass of cold water and measure it really carefully. And then warm it up, but don't let it boil.
Oh, the heat rises?
Water expands when it gets warm. If you expand it enough with enough temperature, it turns to a gas, right? Which is clouds and stuff. So, do you know that just that expansion of the ocean accounts for about 40% of sea level rise? Okay. So when people say, oh, I don't have to worry about it because of this, that, and the other thing, well, guess what? And that's already happening. Now here's another interesting thing. If you live down in Florida, how fast is the sea level rising? 1 inch a year. 1 inch a year. 1 inch a year. That means in 12 years, the sea level in Florida has risen a foot. Now, Ann and I were just down in Atlanta at Al Gore's thing. And he had this hilarious and very troubling photograph. He was parked a mile from the shore in a parking garage. He got down to his truck, and he was in water. Okay? No hurricanes. Nothing happened. Just he was standing in water. By his tire, do you know what he saw? Even weirder. Getting close. Closer. 8 legs. Octopus! There was this big, huge octopus hanging out at his tire in a parking garage in 6 inches of water, a mile from the coast. On a nice sunny day with no hurricanes. Yeah, right? Okay. Well, I mean, this kind of freaked him out. He's like, what have I been saying? Okay? So, also, what happens when the sea level rises is it pushes into the groundwater here on the shore, under the land, and we experience salinization of our groundwater. It gets salty. We can't drink that. It costs communities hundreds of millions of dollars. Oh, there's another direct effect of climate change, is your utilities and infrastructure are impacted, and the price goes through the roof. So this poster shows you some of these things. Now, another key thing in climate change, which has to do with social justice, is most of the communities in the lowlands and where they put things like refineries are in disadvantaged communities. What's a disadvantaged community?
Poverty.
Poverty.
Slums, yeah.
Why?
Because they're subjugated into an area that doesn't have, it lacks resources.
Lacks resources. They might say the land isn't very valuable.
Yeah.
We'll just put it on the table here. A big component of the impacts of climate change have to do with how we treat and affect and fix racism, economic equality, right? Healthcare, all of these things. Disadvantaged communities. This is real. This is real. Okay, now.
Is that happening more outside the U.S. than?
No.
No.
Actually, it's a very minimally reported on things in the press. But we're looking at, we were just down in Atlanta and talking to Reverend Barber, William Barber, who has an incredible database on this, which teachers in the room gotta tie into that guy. In the South, 40%. Across the country, 40% disadvantaged communities are being negatively impacted by climate change. Across the country, those statistics are not in yet, but they're above 20 probably and below 40. So we're somewhere in there. So we're looking at roughly a third of Americans, across all racial profiles, by the way, are being directly impacted by inability to live in the communities they live in because of climate change. Okay? And New London is not far from being impacted by this. It already has. So I want to show you something else. Have you guys ever heard of natural gas?
Yes.
Yes.
What is natural gas? Alistair.
Natural gas is like, it's different from oil. It's some sort of fossil fuel in the ground.
Yeah, and it's a gas. So oil is just a bunch of carbon and hydrogen. And natural gas is just a bunch of carbon and hydrogen. Natural gas is a gas, oil is a liquid. If it gets so thick you can't put it through a pipeline, we call that tar, like the Alberta oil sands, okay, where I work with the Native Americans up there on trying to get things done. 23 oil companies did not want to. But I have this thing on natural gas because everybody on TV is saying it's a bridge fuel. What do they mean by that? Oh, we'll go from fossil fuels to renewable energy by using a fossil fuel? Really? Bud is laughing for a good reason.
I got a bridge for you in Brooklyn.
But here's the truth about natural gas. Now, I'm an economic geologist. I've actually helped discover coal and natural gas discovery in my life. And I'm also a geochemist. Well, you can see on here that at the point where you mine it, that's when you get it out of the ground, we're fracking that rocks. We open up the rocks so the gas can pour into the well and we can pump it to the surface. Now when we frack that ground, it so happens that that's more than 50% of the shale basins that we get our natural gas out of are in or above or near aquifers that have the groundwater that we drink.
Smart.
And we water our crops. This is, if you did this in your house, your dad would say, you're going to have to eat spinach for 1,000 years. That's it, you know? And the thing is, this is happening. I've been to these places, and you can smell it. Now, there's a thing called fugitive gas. At that mine site where they're pumping out of the ground, guess what? The workers who are being paid by the oil companies are showing higher levels of neurological and heart problems from exposure to the solvents used in fracking and natural gas itself. Okay? This is measured by the EPA and the U.S. Geological Survey. So now, let's say, okay, we're not going to worry about that. Let's just put it into a truck or in a pipeline. Let's put it in a pipeline. Well, guess what pipelines do? They leak. You hear about the big oil spills, the big pipeline spills for natural gas? You don't hear about the 2 and 3 and 4,000 of them in the last few years. Now, if it's a pipeline leak of natural gas is heavy, it'll flow into your basement. Buildings have blown up from this. People have died from this. What communities do you think are most impacted by this? Disadvantaged communities. Okay? Because the land is cheap, so they built the refinery or the pump station. If you have a pipeline, it goes this far, then you got to put a pump in there and pump it farther, otherwise the gas just doesn't flow. Those things are so noisy, people go deaf, and they have fugitive gas leaks as well. And when you get to the actual power plant where you're going to burn that natural gas to drive an engine, a steam engine, and that creates electricity, there's a tremendous amount of measured fugitive gases from these plants. So every single place along the entire production and use line of natural gas, we are affecting your health, your quality of life, and your economic viability, and your ability to grow food that's healthy. That's just happening from this. Now, we can talk a whole lot about that stuff, but I'll leave that there. So what can you do? Cool thing. So Ann and I have been in our house 4 or 5 years, maybe 6, I don't know, 4 or 5. We got a house because I work out of my house in my office. We needed a little more space. We got a little place in town, and we saved up our dollars and tens of dollars and hundreds of dollars. So we put solar panels on our house in January. All these photos are from our house. We are producing 138% of the energy we need. Why 138%? Because now, guess what? Do you want to be a power client or customer, or would you like to be a partner? Partner, yeah. You said you were going to go into business. Partnerships? Partnerships? Yeah.
Give me your hand.
So he's now an ambassador to partnerships. The thing is, by producing your own energy, our power bill went way, way, way down. And it'll take about 7 years to pay off the purchase and stuff. But you don't actually have to buy them in Connecticut. There's companies that lease them, so you don't have to pay for the capital costs. Also, this is a thing that a community can do together. And how do we do that thing together? We build something called a microgrid.
Yes.
This is one of Bud's favorite things. What's a microgrid? Your house, in essence, is a microgrid. Now, you're importing energy for that, but if you are producing your own by sun or wind, and say you tie it into 6 of your neighbors, you are a microgrid. Okay? The U.S. Army gets around the world by bringing with it microgrids. A nuclear submarine is a microgrid. A truck with a refrigeration unit on it is a microgrid, in a sense, a teeny tiny microgrid. But the thing is, these can be any scale. We need more of these through deregulation. 1, your power is cheaper. 2, it's easier to go with renewables. 3, it's safer from terrorist attacks, because if they attack the grid, who is here for some of the big brownouts on the East Coast? Yeah, none of you are old enough, maybe a couple of us. But the thing is, our grid system is in trouble. So, Ann and I approached the mayor to try to get the school district to put solar panels on the school. Guess what they said?
No?
This is hilarious. Now, you as a businessman better pay attention to this. So here's what they said, Sean. It's too expensive.
It pays for itself.
So me, being somebody who's actually designed and works with companies to put those things in, said, oh, show me the sheets, show me the budgets, show me the comparison. Oh, well, we don't have those. And I said, so you don't know that it's more expensive? And they said, yes, we did, because the architect told us. Has the architect ever installed solar panels? Couldn't find out. If he had, we'd probably find. Is he leadership in energy and environmental design? Is he LEED certified? No. Does he know about LEED? No. Guess what? He simply told your community, no, it's not affordable. Guess what? Sandy Hook put, through the Green Bank in Connecticut, put solar panels on their building, Sandy Hook. And
Newtown, yeah.
they save how much?
Oh, over 25 years, it's going to be $1.2 million.
Yeah, $1.2 million, and that's your taxpayer dollar.
Wow.
So it is irresponsible, if I can say such a thing, in closed company, right? It is irresponsible of an elected official not to adequately compare the two choices through a rigorous financial model. This is why your vote is so important.
Have you pursued that any further with the
Yes.
town? Yeah.
We tied into the
Do you have
agreement.
any, do you have any allies?
There were a lot of people
Oh, there's some.
apparently.
Yeah. So I'm going to show you one other thing,
So,
and then these are here. If you want to stick around afterwards, we can talk about them. I've got a thing on electric vehicles.
yeah, they should.
These are cool. We have a 25-year-old Volvo, so when that dies, any minute. Battery technology, within the next 2 years, they're going to be up to 200, 300, 400, maybe 500-mile driving distances before you have to recharge. Right now, the average is between about 85 and 250.
How long does it take to recharge?
They have super fast rechargers on something like the Tesla, so in 20 minutes you recharge.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Tesla.
So, yeah, I know.
Start
Teslas
saving your
are cool.
pennies, get some partners.
So those things are there. So again, you have a lot of choices on how to move forward to address climate change. The last thing I'm going to say is I'm with a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a bill in Congress, H.R. 763. It is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It is the first bill ever not to cost the government any money and send you a check every month called a carbon dividend, so that when the fee of $15 a ton in the first year, $10 every year after is applied to oil, natural gas, and coal, your power company is just going to say, well, that's more expensive, so I'm going to increase your bill, right? But you'll get a check every month from the Department of Treasury, and if you're in the lower 2/3 wage earners of America, that's most of us,
Yep.
you will make money or break even with that check. So you are not penalized as we transform our economy from a carbon economy to a renewable energy thing. I've got a book over there that I wrote. Oh, it's right here. If you're interested, here's how you do it. Yeah.
Is nuclear or thorium or fusion or fission or whatever, or any of those valuable things for energy?
Nuclear energy is very viable. In fact, we get 8% of it in the United States today. It is in the plan that I've worked out in this book to include nuclear, especially Westinghouse has a thing called a micronuclear grid system. These can power cities of 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 people, and they're very safe, lots of backup systems, state-of-the-art technology. Canada, Europe, Japan, China are putting these things in right now.
Not in the United States.
There's a few that are going through there's 3 going through the permitting process, but the U.S. system is antiquated, older than me, and so it's a real challenge.
People make a lot of money off
All right. So again, I'm Bonnie Johnston, a science teacher, and my background is environmental science, and that was when I was an undergrad is when I first began interested in climate change, and I've been interested ever since.
My name is Sean Brooks, and I'm a senior at Science and Technology Magna High School / New London High School. What brought me here today is because I'm very passionate about environmental justice, social justice, and this is a concern that more folks need to know. So I just want to be an agent of change and spread awareness and knowledge of this matter.
I'm a 7th grader at the Interdistrict School for Arts and Communication, also known as Isaac. I'm Alistair Haglund. The reason I'm here is because of Kevin Booker, so thank you.
You can keep that right there. I'll share this one. I'm Roger Coons, economic geologist and naturalist and climate. We're just trying to get action on climate. And Ann and I, my wife over there, and we're in this together. So here we are.
I'm Kristin Paisano. I am an educator. I have a master's degree almost in a week in STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. Yeah. Thank you. And I'm just a concerned citizen, has always been an environmentalist. And great.
Awesome. Can we get a round of applause for our awesome panelists here? The trajectory of our planet is in our hands. When I was in Puerto Rico in 2017, I volunteered for the Red Cross, and I took 2 months off of work and everything. And when I went to Puerto Rico, I remember I was at the Boston airport, and they said, well, there were only approximately 69 casualties. 69 people may have passed away. And when I get down there, I was doing bulk distribution throughout the entire island, and I was also doing spiritual care as well for 2 months. And you know, I remember going down there and going throughout the entire island. Every day I would work 16 hours a day and volunteering my time. And being in that environment, I would see the devastation of what occurred on the island. And then I was communicating with so many people, and I realized that the death toll was a lot higher than what they were actually broadcasting and letting us know what was occurring here in the States. So for my young individuals on this panel today, and first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for being here, because Sean, you're in high school, and Alistair, you're in 7th grade, and it's a pleasure and honor to have you all here today, but especially you two individuals, because you are going to lead this in the next direction as we get a little older here. and we have to move on. So the question I have for you is describe the turning point in your life where you felt that you had to make this like one of your number one issues. And why? Why was this a turning point in your life? Like, why are you here? And why is this such a pressing issue to you?
Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna pause and think about it.
It's okay.
Want to give it a shot? Almost there.
I know.
My bedtime.
Uh-oh.
So it's one of my most pressing issues since my dad, I have as a grandpa a physicist, and then my dad's a political scientist, and so they influence me a lot, and my other grandpa too. And also, if you look on the internet and all that stuff in the Wall Street Journal, they're talking about climate change, and it's a pretty big issue, or a lot of people claim it is. So, I mean, if I feel like I don't necessarily support, like, the majority, but it's like, it just has impact for the future. It has a bigger impact than, let's say, the Red Sox winning the World Series in 2018. So it's just like a big impact, and it's something we can prevent now and not suffer the consequences in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would say a turning point for me probably was when I was in my sophomore year of high school. In my biology class, we would have different geology moments where we would just take time outside of biology and just like look at, the earth. And so that kind of what kept my mind going. But as I got older, just really digging deep and seeing how the environment and the impacts it has on people, it has it on us, is devastating. So I really took out the time to do a lot of investigating, look into different like avenues and industries, like, wow, like this really affects people. Although there's different notions that, that stuff's not interesting, but it's like you have to get educated in order to be prepared. And I just think this topic, a lot of people aren't as educated as they should be, because this affects us. This affects my grandkids. This affects our future generation and affects us now. So this issue is very imperative that we get educated, we learn about it. So I'm glad I'm here just to keep bringing awareness to even my school, because even as a STEM school, this should definitely be a topic of a conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. In the past 2 years, I have watched the news, and every morning around 5 o'clock in the morning, I get up and, I'm always paying attention, and I read the paper, and I hear some of our leaders in D.C. say, oh, that's fake news. Do not listen. We do not have a climate change issue. I don't understand what these scientists and these other individuals are discussing at this point in time. There's not really an issue. They're just making all this stuff up. What I would like to know from some of my experts on the panel, what are the misconceptions of climate change? And if you can just please give us an example, and please just, because for the listeners who are listening to this, what are some of the misconceptions? Bonnie?
Well, I would start by saying that there's still the misconception that it's an unsettled issue, and that that the data is out, that there's data both sides. But if you saw the graphs earlier, we have all this data that is showing our greenhouse gases have risen, and with that, it's closely correlated with the temperature rising. So the fact that we have all data going back 700,000 years, you can see that the impact that humans have been having. So climate change is happening. There can be dispute about the amount that humans have impacted it, which you see a lot. But I think that it's settled science that climate change, that we are in the middle of an extreme warming event in our climate. And what we do about that is a major concern. You can you can argue about that, but I think right now the argument we have is past, is whether or not that there is climate change.
But Bonnie, can I play devil's advocate for a moment?
Yes.
But when I go down to Florida and I'm on my golf course and I don't really see any changes really happen to the climate. It's been the same way at the golf course for 40 years. I mean, everything looks great. The air that I'm breathing is perfectly fine. I get on my jet plane and I'm all set. I really do not see any of the issues that are really occurring.
Right.
I don't know, Roger, can you please expand on that for me? I mean, are there really any misconceptions, or are these people just coming up with this fake news? I don't know.
There are misconceptions, and there's also, I would say, leaving out the exceptions. So as Bonnie mentioned in her talk, one of the big misconceptions is the difference between weather and climate. It's when Senator Inhofe comes into the chambers of Congress with a snowball in winter and says, see, there's no global warming. Well, it's winter, and even with global warming, we get winter. So that is confusing weather and climate. And another thing that directly confuses the issue is something you just mentioned very clearly. I don't see any impacts. I don't see any impacts. So what impacts are you looking for? If you're looking for a Bruce Willis movie, well, that happened in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria. Okay, that's happened with other hurricanes. So maybe you're just not in that spot where that disaster movie is being lived out by real people who really are dying. And more people now have died in Puerto Rico as a result of this hurricane than we lost in 9/11. And as AOC said, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, what was our reaction after 9/11 when 2,000 Americans died? And what is our reaction after Hurricane Maria after 3,000 people have died? Big difference. So that's part of it. When somebody says, I don't see any effects, I suggest a field trip. Find somebody who can take them down to a place. And in a good place to go here is to the Naval Station and the Coast Guard Academy. They have a very well thought out, detailed plan of action to address climate change, and it's going to use billions of our tax dollars. You got one? You got one, son?
And for Kristin, Kristin, as you're sitting there, you're a community activist, you're a grad student, and you're a teacher. And many people who are probably watching this are probably saying to themselves, well, even if I could make certain changes, it probably would be very expensive for me to make certain changes. So how can you make changes on a limited income to really making yourself, making sure that you have, you're dedicating yourself to creating changes in the environment. But some people may say, I can't do it because it's cheaper for me to just go to Wendy's, or it's cheaper for me to just go out and throw the soda away in this can because it's easier, it's here, because we live in a disposable generation. Everything is at our fingertips. What advice would you have for those individuals, who are, because we, as human beings, we become, very socialized and comfortable. So what advice would you have for those individuals who are living on a limited income and on a budget right now, and they're like, I cannot afford to make those changes at this point?
I think it depends. One, as an educator, I think we need to do more of it. We need to educate more our children about it, because they're the solutions, right? I mean, they're the solutions. They're the people who are going to come up with the next solution of what to do, and educating them, I think, is the first priority about what's happening and kind of what they can do. I mean, even this, right? Like, I'm staring at it going, where is my, I mean, you can buy a stainless steel water bottle for $8, $10, and not have to buy a case of this every week. You know what I mean? That's a huge savings there. You could use that. I mean, just kind of looking at what you can do with your money and rebudgeting it. Like, okay, if I make that change and I buy a water bottle, there's there's an extra, I don't know,
But
depending
Kristin, what
on
if
the
I live in
family.
Flint, Michigan, or if I live in Newark, New Jersey at this point, where they're having issues with water and there are toxins in their water? And I'm like, it's cheaper for me to buy this bottle of water. I don't want my children drinking out of this faucet because I don't want my children to end up with cancer or any other illness that's going to affect them later on in life. What can I do then? What will help me then? Because every day I get up and I'm living in a very poor community. I'm dealing with all this stress every single day. And the only thing I know is that if I buy this case of water for $3.99 at the dollar store, then that will help my family. Mm-hmm. What can I do? I understand there are issues about the environment. I understand, but I also have to take care of my children. That 2-year-old and that 4-year-old who desperately need water. What can I do for them?
So, boy, I'm glad you brought this up. Mm-hmm. This is for emergency purposes. Flint is an emergency.
Absolutely.
Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico, emergency. You can't drink the water. You'll get sick or die. And in fact, some of the deaths are because of contaminated water in both Flint and in Puerto Rico. So these are emergency utility things. Now, if, though, as you mentioned, food, like a Wendy's versus going to someplace else, in every community we have these things called food deserts. This is where you cannot buy affordable, healthy food. And so you resort to the 59-cent burrito, which is made out of meat. Each one of those things has bits and pieces of over 1,000 cows in it. And the level of contaminants in these things, as we hear in the news periodically, it's common. So how do you do that? This is a community issue to me. This is a community resilience issue. In our disadvantaged communities, what's next to a disadvantaged community, aside from maybe a refinery or a power plant or something? But guess what? Usually a road, and then less, that's right, an advantaged community. But it's still part of the same community. Mm-hmm. And so we have to cross this road, and we have to help each other and help those people through community actions, through community-generated help, food banks, education as well, jobs. I mean, respectful jobs that bring in a living wage. What's a living wage in Groton and New London today? Does anybody know? Per hour? What's a living wage per hour?
10, right?
10.
A living wage was $15.
I'm talking about a living wage, not what you're going to get paid. It's north of 15.
Yeah.
That's right. It's between $15 and $18. 22 is definitely going to make it. But depending on how you budget it. So the community is the really thing, and that gets down to who you elect to make sure that we have lead-free pipes, that we have access to bottled water in stainless steel things and things we can reuse, that we have access to a grocery store that's not, where I go in with my wallet and I come out with one apple. I mean, it's really got to be affordable. This is a community thing.
And for my students who are on the panel, what would you like to see change within your school? And what changes have occurred in your school when it pertains to like the environment and making the school a little bit more accessible?
I'll go. Well, the meat industry actually produces like the same amount of CO2 as like all planes, cars, ships, trains, boats, and all that stuff. The meat industry equals the amount of CO2 caused by that, or all the food being moved around and all that stuff to try and finally get the meat to stores and to customers. At school we have a lot of wasted food, and like what my science teacher was talking about, like it didn't get any traction, but maybe if we could have like a compost bin, a true waste bin, and then like also our trays are wasteful because they aren't like, they're like paper or some sort of cardboard, and then you just throw it away. And also, I'd really like if we had more education in this,
Wow.
not just talking about events that happen halfway across the world. I think we should talk about what's happening to now and the big issue.
All right, Alistair. All right. Jeez.
I absolutely second, third, exactly what Alistair said. But yes, like same thing in my school with the different waste of food, and how we started the compost, but it just didn't turn out well. So I wish we can bring it back, as well as just maybe absolutely having like a community like action plan, like having conversations like these, but bringing students together, and not just students in the school, but like elected officials on what we're going to do for our community, because all the problems we mentioned just now in the panel, like food deserts and lack of access, that happens in all of our communities, especially community I come from, New London, or we come from New London. So it should be more than conversations, and what moving forward can we implement so these changes won't be drastic and harm the people that live in these communities.
You want to say something? Oh, okay. Well, can I just circle back? I was just thinking about how this can all come together, and I'm thinking about sustainability, and that the urgency of finding solutions is here. It's major. So I don't think there's enough urgency with what needs to happen to reduce the impact of climate change, because it's going to happen whether we do anything or not. So wouldn't we rather start thinking about ways that we can live more sustainably, less wastefully, and reduce the impact of our community? And it has to be global changes as well. But that can help reduce what's going to happen, because as we see right now, there are global impacts, there are local impacts, but it's going to get worse if we don't do anything to change that quickly. So that's a big takeaway for me, and why it's so important to educate, that you guys are here, that we educate your generation, because we're starting it now, but you guys are going to have to finish it. So that's what I was thinking, just listening to you guys, what you had to say.
Thank you very much. 2 years ago, I came across an incredible book on sustainability by Jeffrey Sachs. And Jeffrey Sachs, in his book, he really illustrated how in India and in China, things are changing because they would love to emulate Western culture. And their middle class is growing. And because their middle class is growing, that means more people will love to have cars. More people will love to live like the West, the way we actually live as far as exploiting certain resources. So that means more people are consuming the resources of the planet. So for my panelists here, and I think about how it's really detrimental to our environment on so many levels. How is this actually going to impact our environment? And is there any way to turn this around when, as human beings, we get accustomed to a way of living? So either one of you, Kristin, Roger. Yeah, please.
I'll kind of start by going off what Roger said in the back. I mean, if you're a homeowner, I mean, the solar is huge. My little solar app tells me how much CO2 I'm saving, and it equates it to like how many trees I'm planting by having the solar on your house. And I think there's this huge misconception that it's very expensive. It literally, I did a loan, but the amount I pay on the loan is like almost identical exactly to my electric bill. Like, I don't pay a penny more than I would pay for my regular electric into the house. And when that's paid off in 8 years, I will not have an electric bill, and I'll actually be creating energy. And that's like, goes to like the CO2 is one of our really big challenges. On a smaller scale, although not so small, when we talk about recycling, upcycling, people are like, oh, recycling, well, it's not so much. Okay, but it's not nothing, which is what a lot of communities are doing. And nothing, I mean, in our cities at least in the northern part of the state, like, no recycling exists. In some of our schools, there's no recycling. I mean, ultimately, we'd be upcycling, right? Like, Adidas has the shoe that's coming out. They're making out of, like, the plastic from the sea, water. Like, there's progress that's happening. It's just slow and in some places non-existent. So how do we get those things moving? Like, how do we get our kids to kind of progress?
That's a good question.
Do you guys want to say something like what you'd be willing to do?
Or would you be willing to do anything?
So we're saying the lifestyle, the Western culture. I mean, the Western culture, it seems a lot better because we have like more freedom than them, and we have Wendy's, like we have Wendy's and Taco Bell. But I mean, it's just that we live in a very like more relaxed, and we have a lot more access to resources, and we have all this more social stuff than maybe India and China because they have so many people. And I mean, one way to prevent this is to dampen its effects is for us kind of, if they're rising to as much stuff, we have to decrease so they can increase. So we have to decrease our energy or CO2 emissions so it can kind of go equal in a sense.
So you're kind of saying we need to be a community globally?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So what you're saying also is we should model positive behavior when it comes to the environment? I don't know.
So
Something.
show them
Roger?
how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Look at all these microphones. So China actually is using so much energy that they have installed more solar and wind farms in the United States. They also have more coal-fired power plants. But they also, on average, use about 60% less than we do today. So I'm going to ask you about a thing called an eco-footprint. So Alistair and I were looking at a graph I have back there that you might want to look at that has too many people plot. When did the Earth pass the point where it could sustainably support its population? And on that graph it says 1982, calculated by an Australian who did his PhD on the subject, which I can talk to you about if you're interested. But in America, because of our diet, because the average home has 2 cars, because the average home has a mess of pets. Pets actually have a big carbon footprint. Because the average home eats a lot of meat. The average home does not use renewable energy. The average home does not use public transportation. So the eco-footprint in terms of how many Earths you need for the average American to sustain the lifestyle today, anybody know what it is?
How many Earths?
How many Earths of resources do we need to sustain the average American today? And it's a lot more than 1 Earth.
2,000?
Wow, that's a lot more. It's 5.5. So we need 4.5 more Earths if we're not going to change our behavior.
And that's just for Americans?
That's just for Americans. If you're a vegan living in an apartment with no pets, no car, use public transportation, your footprint is still 2.1 for an American. So what does that mean, do you think, Alistair and Sean? If we're using 5.5 Earths, what's somebody in a less developed country getting?
Less.
How much less?
If you say 60% less than China, that'd be more like 2 Earths.
Yeah, you're doing the math. That's good. So if you went to a place like Burkina Faso in West Africa, all right, in the Sahel, the sub-Saharan, they're consuming on average 0.1 Earths a year.
0.1.
Yeah, but we're using 5.5, 5.5. They're using 10% of 1%. So when we use more Earths here, we are taking it from somebody else in the world. Is that fair? No. Tell me why.
Well, it's not well, it's not fair and it's like not just because we're removing, it's like a give and take system, or just like a mind system. And I just hate that. Wow. It's just such like an injustice, but it really just, it's like we're such a consumerist society that we just want to consume. And I think we should be a model example for other nations that look at us as much as we consume. If we like start being more sustainable in the resources that we use and we change our ways, then we can lead by example. But yeah, I just don't like that.
Bonnie, how does that make you feel?
I think that what Sean's saying is spot on. Is that we are consumer driven, and that we have been operating at a pace where we have, as developed countries, the United States and Europe, have been emitting more of the greenhouse gases than the now developing countries. So, in effect, a lot of the change that has come is because of the developed countries have been put into place. So that's another frame where there's heavy responsibility, I think, that lies on the Western countries. And I think that what you're saying, lead by example, is a good way to go. And if we're talking about adopting technologies that can be used to mitigate the effects of climate change, I think that we should be leaders in that, in adopting those technologies that can reduce our carbon footprint, and helping export those technologies to people as they are coming up and using more energy. And maybe instead of continuing to burn coal, export the technologies that can do that to reduce our emissions worldwide.
Kristin, you want to elaborate or expand on that?
Yeah, I do, because he brought up something which I'm glad he said, because I had it written down too. So about consumerism, what can we do, right? So, I mean, being a conscious consumer is huge. Even if you don't know, about the carbon footprint, or you don't know about the food being produced. I mean, there's so many other things you can do, like try to not consume plastic. Like for me, I was like, I will not put another piece of plastic in my house. And something small like that, and it's like, it might be hard, but you just look at it and you go, I can't do this. Like making plastic, disposing of plastic, it's toxic, similar to kind of the diagram you had there, and the plants that make it and the plants that melt it. I mean, people who work there get cancer, so it's like, and it's just waste, and we see it in our oceans, so some things that's on a small level that you can commit to that are really small, but that you can do, will also have a huge impact.
And Roger, how will the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act of 2019 affect our society and environment?
I'm glad you asked, Kevin.
Absolutely. I had to ask that one. I know.
Yeah. We, so as I mentioned, Ann and I are part of Citizens Climate Lobby, and a couple of you in the room have come to those meetings, so thank you for doing that. We're a not-for-profit organization. I don't get paid for doing what I do with them. But it's a respectful, nonpartisan, listening organization. But in all of that also, we have some of the powerhouses in the science, economic, social, and political sphere as volunteers in there. In fact, Dr. James Hansen, the father of modern climate studies, who has testified before Congress, he's on our advisory board. So is James Baker, by the way. So Citizens Climate Lobby came up with the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of 2019. We did submit it last year, and it got a bill number in the 115th Congress, the 116th Congress now. This is a unique bill. There has never been a bill like this going into committee. It's going into Ways and Means Committee now in the House of Representatives. One, it puts a price on carbon where the fossil fuel is mined, pumped out of the ground, or the port of first entry from a country that does not have a carbon tax. If they do have a carbon tax in that country, you get a border adjustment, so you're not double taxed. Okay, so $15 a ton contained CO2, equivalent to CO2. So when you burn a ton of coal, if you burn a ton of coal, CO2, How many tons of CO2 do you think you get?
15.
Well, CO2, that's a hint. So about almost 2 tons of CO2, okay? And so a ton of coal in West Virginia goes for about $60 a ton. If you suddenly have a $15 a ton CO2 that's produced, that means that ton of coal is going to have a $30 fee attached to it. So this bill actually drives innovation in the renewable energy sector. So because we won't have coal. Coal is already non-economic, by the way, by itself. The second thing it does is it creates 2.1 million jobs in 10 years. The third thing it does is in 12 years it reduces U.S. national emissions across the board by 40%. No bill in Congress does that now. No bill proposed in Congress does that now. But here's the amazing thing. By 2050, how old are you going to be in 2050? Really old.
About 40.
Yeah.
Thinking of running for president in 20.
All right. He's got a presidential candidate. We got an announcement here.
That's right.
So by 2050, this bill will have reduced U.S. emissions by 90%. 90%. Now, the Paris Accord doesn't even come close to any of these numbers, not even close. The third thing it does is it innovates, it looks at how the government helps with innovation in the sector. The next thing it does is every month it sends you a check called a carbon dividend check from the U.S. Treasury Carbon Dividend Fund. Every month that money is collected. Between 2 and 7% of it is used to administer the costs. This is important because this makes it a revenue neutral bill in Congress. That means no dollars out of the general budget are used to operate this program. It's all self-funded. So if somebody says this bill will make your taxes go up, no. It'll make the deficit go up, no. It won't do that. In fact, it'll help in the reverse. So you're going to get a bill every month from the power company and say it's $50. But now they're buying natural gas from someplace and they're paying this fee, so they've added $5 onto that bill, so it's $55. Well, right next to this bill is an envelope from the Department of Treasury that you open up with a $25 check in it. So 2/3 of the wage earners of America, 2/3 will make money or break even on this. This means that all disadvantaged communities, low income and medium income people will not be financially directly impacted by this. Will they be impacted in other ways? Yes, because we're transforming the economy. So this is the first bill. This is the first bill. I can't stress this enough. This is the first bill that we need to pass to significantly address climate change in the time frame we have. And does anybody remember what the National Climate Assessment Report and the IPCC said that we have to act in how many years?
What was it, Bonnie?
12 years.
12 years.
Say it again, Bonnie.
12 years.
A little louder, please.
12 years.
12 years.
That means we can't wait 12 years,
That's right.
right? Because you're going to be 20, 19, 18.
24.
24. Oh, he's a lot older than I thought. So when you're 24, if we haven't done this, your quality of life might be less than it is today.
Well,
Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen Hawking, one of his quotes, he said that humans need to get to another planet or like at least find another place to live in space within the next 1,000 years or else we'll die in a sense because I feel like life will deteriorate. That's what we're doing now because that's from what he was saying then, probably like 5 years ago. Because he died recently. So that could mean that if we continue ramping up energy production and all this stuff, it's going to make it even sooner, maybe 500 years or whatever.
5 years.
Yeah. And one thing about his good thing, it doesn't cost $80 trillion like the Green New Deal.
The Green New Deal, what'd you say?
The estimates were about $80 trillion.
Yeah, those, he mentioned the Green New Deal, which is important to mention because we've got, our Congressman, Joe Courtney, is a co-sponsor. Did you know that? District 2, Connecticut. He co-sponsored the Green New Deal. And he's the guy, did you vote for him? Who knows? But the thing is, our congressman who represents you in Washington, D.C. and helps make the budgets and pass the bills, he is in favor of the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal is a resolution, H.R. 109. And that means it's not law, it's a concept, it's a philosophy. This bill that we have in, for instance, H.R. 763, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, could be the first bill to pass that would actually help the Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal has not been costed out yet because they haven't gotten that far. So the numbers you're expressing are very preliminary. Yeah. So keep track of that, though. Keep doing your math. I'm very impressed. It's good.
So in closing, and we looked at 12 years from now, our community will be a lot different. Our country will be a lot different in just 12 years. Alistair will be 24 years old. Sean will be 30 years old in just 12 years. So what are local issues that people in southeastern Connecticut should focus their attention on when it comes to their environment? And as a region, what can we do to be a model for other communities? Bonnie?
So I'm thinking going forward that we do need to have preparations, planning for what's to come because we are a coastal community and we're already seeing those effects, right? And so I think planning needs to be a big part of it. I know there has been already. I think there is already a sea level rise plan for the area, but beyond sea level rise, how are we going to address all of the problems that might come and plan ahead for that? That's what I would say.
Thank you.
What do you think?
Sean?
Yes, moving forward, I think, I think we should kind of come up with like a plan or a solution, from like even now going forward, just on like just little ways that we can do should just affect change. So like I think even after the panel, we can brainstorm ideas just to help our community, because I think just a few of us coming together is a step of the way, and then other districts and regions want to model us, and I think that's one of the ways we can affect change in our community, in our local communities.
Thank you. Alistair?
So I think what we should focus on is, where we get our energy, because we have a nuclear power plant. There's this video and it said the bad idea is sticking dangerous radioactive waste in the ground, but the worst idea is polluting the air by burning fossil fuels. So, would you rather pick the bad idea or the worst idea? Because solar panels, it might be hard to get a loan if you're disadvantaged or your credit score is bad or whatever. And it might be hard to get solar panels. Like our house, they said no because in the sunlight it won't work. So we could if you could pick between your coal plant or your millstone or the nuclear plant, you should pick the nuclear plant because that is less CO2 than your fossil fuels. And it's the bad idea, not the worst idea.
That's very good. Thank you. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. 12 years old.
Well, I think you should be the Secretary of Energy.
Absolutely.
They need a new one, I think.
Yeah, they need one now. You want to get them down there for an interview? I'm heartened by hearing these things. And so I have a rule that Ann and I are working for in this community and other communities where I work, solar panels on every roof. It's required by law now in California. And how do you pay for it if you can't afford it? So this is a community effort. This goes to funding. This goes to who you elect. So what are we spending money on in our community that is not as effective as helping the whole community have lower energy and renewable energy resources? That we already know. So we can actually afford to start that process in Groton, New London, Stonington, Mystic. We can do that now. We already have the technology, we know we have the money, and we just have to prioritize. So number one, solar panels in every single roof. The second thing is getting the community to come together and help those people through community-oriented. Now we're parts of Rise Up Mystic, and Rise Up Mystic is an organization that is working towards social justice in the context of climate change and gun laws and these other things. And the last thing that I'd say is job training. The job training, key. Now you're going to do that, you're doing that. You're getting people ready for this stuff. Hardest job in the world, but it's the most important job in the world. And you don't have to have a college degree to install solar panels. You can have 2 years of tech school or get on the job training in some cases. These are living wage jobs. Some of them go up to $22, $25 an hour after a year or two. And so the community can make sure that the facilities and the tech schools and all of that are focused on the people that can and are coming up, like you guys.
Wow. Kristin?
I'm going to stem off of what he said actually earlier in the back, which someone else keyed in on, is like, number one is education. I mean, we're sitting here in a room and we're educating each other, we're learning from each other, even us and you. And I think that's a huge part. I mean, you have to get people on the wagon. And I think because there's just a lack of knowledge that really, communities should be focusing on how do we educate people, like you kind of need that buy-in, and we need to foster that, because I think that there's always the naysayers, or the people even in our lives who are just like, well, it doesn't really affect me, like my garbage still gets taken away, and like I wake up in the morning and I breathe, and so I think that to kind of get it all moving, you need people, and you need to educate them so that they can support.
Yeah, we need that consensus because the urgency is not there, and it needs to be. So that's how I feel.
Engage social media. Social media is such a big part
Correct.
of everybody's lives. We all require social media. We make steps in the right direction.
So community
Absolutely.
engagement ideas, things like that.
So for the listeners who are listening to this program, can you leave them with a statement or a quote? Something about the environment, something that you're feeling now, maybe at this moment, just so, for people who are saying, well, what can I do? How can I get involved in? Just something to make people think about. Okay? Starting with you, Bonnie.
Okay. Let me think. Thinking of Stephen Hawking, what he said. As it is right now, we only have one Earth, and if we need 5 of them, we really are not going to be able to make that last. So I'm thinking we all really need to think about personally what we can do to live more sustainably, and how we can work in our community to really embrace sustainability as well. Because if I'm planning to stay on this earth, I don't know about everyone else, but I'd like to make it a nice one to live on.
Thank you. Sean?
M.K. Asante once says, he's a Morgan State professor, if you make an observation, you have an obligation. So that I'm saying that like now we all have an obligation, and you as a viewer have an obligation to make a difference, whether that's something small, spreading awareness, or doing something that definitely helps just to sustain energy and the environment. So please do that.
Buy a Tesla. Okay, no, that's not what I'm really saying. Well, just promote awareness and do your best to try and do your little part, and one drop will fill the bucket. Many drops will fill the bucket eventually. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's great.
Great.
Good job, Grasshopper. I agree with everything that everybody's saying, so I'm going to say vote twice. Once in the voting booth, and then every day with your wallet. Vote, vote, vote for the people that have the long view, your interest, understand the issues, and if they don't understand them, go meet them. And if anybody wants to come with us next time we have a meeting with Joe Courtney, sign up over there. I'll give you a call. All sorts of microphones.
I think my key point is just get involved, find a way to get involved. If you're not sure how to get involved, if you're a student, if you're younger, find a teacher, find someone in your school, find a way to be involved. Use your social media, use your whatever, find a way, some way to get involved with, progress and changing our environment, because if you want to have a family, if you're young, if you want to have a family, if you want to continue having a family that can live and breathe and eat, then something needs to be done. So get involved. Great.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to be here. I really have a lot of respect for every single one of you, and I appreciate all of you as well. But the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, once said, "Education is the most powerful tool you can use to change the world." Now, tonight, you have observed, you have analyzed some of the data that was shared with you about our planet. Because it is true, the trajectory of our planet is in our hands. And I remember when I taught middle school, one of my students shared with me, he said, "Mr. Booker, there's a poem I want to share with you. It's called Excuses." And it goes, excuses, excuses, excuses. Excuses are the tools of the incompetent, which create monuments of nothingness. And those who specialize in the use of these tools seldom amount to anything. Excuses, excuses, excuses. Excuses are the tools of the incompetent, which create monuments of nothingness. And those who specialize in the use of these tools seldom amount to anything. Now, tonight, we came together as a community. We came together as a collective representing Southeastern Connecticut. And it's up to us in this room, as leaders in this room, to make sure we push this agenda forward, that we do not make any excuses as to why we cannot change our community for generations to come. This is a very excellent program. I thank you, Ann Campbell. I thank you very much as well, always. And thank you, Groton Public Library, for hosting this program.